Hello, and welcome to the Adventures in Arting podcast, where we analyze, explore, and celebrate the creative journey. My name is Julie Fei-Fan, and I am a working artist living outside of Boston. I've been hosting this podcast with my super special co-host and my mom, Eileen hsu-Balzer, since 2012. Hi, Mom.
Hello, Julie.
So if you want to develop a strong and thriving art practice, I hope you'll check out myartpractice.com. Myartpractice.com is a monthly membership site with a robust community and tons of great art content at your fingertips, day or night. I asked people on the message board recently about what they were most looking to get out of my art practice, and member Molly said, I'm looking forward to all of it. There's so much here: community, learning, techniques, guest artists, art movements, and discovery, practice lessons. There's just such a wealth of material, and I am excited to dig through all of it. Thank you for setting up this space, Julie. It's definitely worth the money. I have so many ideas after working through half of the passion and purpose section. I'll have to sit down, organize my thoughts and ideas. I probably have enough inspiration for 5 years worth of work, if not more. I recently purchased your Carved December workbook, and I'm going to start one for each of my ideas and themes, so I'm set up to move forward when I'm ready. The tricky part is deciding which inspiration to pursue first. I thought that was a great comment and really got at how much there is in the myartpractice.com classroom and online site. So don't wait. Get on the wait list at myartpractice.com and be the first to know when the doors open in August for Cycle 2. The focus of Cycle 2 is going to be on iteration, otherwise known as working in a series. So I'm super excited about it. Now, today's episode is a little bit of a surprise. I usually give Mom a PDF before the show so she can know what it is we're talking about. And today she's going in blind, just like the old days. So the reason that I made today a blind podcast is because I knew she would never agree to it if I did.
Well, I haven't agreed to it.
So this is episode 162 called "Why Do You Host This Podcast with Your Mom?"
Oh, okay.
Okay, so it's a light version of what I threatened you with before, which is a podcast all about you.
Can I ask you, is it why do you host this podcast with your mom, or why do you host this podcast with your mom? In other words, is it why I'm the other host?
Yeah, it's why you are so important to the incredible and undeniable success of this show.
The wisdom that comes out as we talk.
The wisdom that just comes flying out of your mouth at every moment. It's very exciting. So I've organized the podcast into sections to warm Mom up for when she'll tell us all her childhood secrets and bedwetting stories. And we begin with the spark, or the origin story really, of the podcast and how that came out. Then we go into sort of challenges and learning and growth that we've had, a little bit of the behind the scenes of making the podcast. Then we go into the mom sections question. I'm saying that with very threatening face right now, and she's looking very coy. And then finally we get to sort of the evolution of the podcast, and then talk a little bit about sort of any future plans and aspirations. So let's begin easy and say, do you remember when I told you that I wanted to do a podcast?
Long ago.
I might. At all?
But as with most of your ideas that involve a change, I always start out by saying, oh no, not me, that won't work. Are you sure? Why are we doing this?
Yes. So back in 2012, if you can get in your time machine with me, it was a time when podcasts were not that common. Like, right, there were podcasts, but there weren't a lot of like podcast plugins or easy ways to do it. So you had to have a lot of technical knowledge, which was something of a barrier. People were using like sound mixing boards and serious audio equipment, and even like listening to a podcast, like it's not like you could, it was super easy. Like you had to, was sort of like different ways you had to do it. Anyway, all that is to say, I went to this huge blogging conference, and I just got exposed to a lot of different ideas about blogging. And there was a breakout session about podcasts. And I was sort of fascinated by this idea, because if there's one thing I can do, It's talk. And I thought,
That's your
wow.
secret power. It's your secret superpower, actually.
I don't think it's secret though. But there's, it was one of those things where I was like, wow, something where you can just like talk. That sounds amazing. And I still remember there was a woman there who had I don't think it was barnyard themed. But it was somehow animal themed, and it has converted into my head in barnyard theme because she demonstrated how she like played animal noises and talked and how she mixed it all. And I was very intrigued. And so after that, I did some research and I found a guy who coached people in how to start podcasts. That was his whole business. So I hired him and he took me through like all the equipment that you needed to do. And I told mom, who said she wasn't going to do it. And I told her she was. And then she said she absolutely wasn't going to do it. And then I told her she was. And then we had a podcast. My original vision of this, the reason I called it Adventures in Arting is at the time, and it's a belief I still have, but was the idea that there are many different sort of kinds of artists, which is why we've had as guests people who are singers, people who are botanists, people who are, you know, do things that are outside of just visual art. I would say in the last like 5 years, it has turned much more primarily over into visual art as opposed to the wide variety of art. But that was the original intention. And I had also been a guest on, there was a scrapbooking podcast back in the day. And I had been a guest on that podcast and I had found that to be very intriguing. And their model was to have, it was called Paper Clipping Roundtable. And their model was to have like 3 guests maybe who talked all on some certain topic. And so because of that, I immediately was like, oh, a podcast has guests. And to be fair, that was the format for most podcasts at the time. And so we booked a lot of guests, as you'll recall, like almost every single episode was an interview with a guest. And then my recollection of it, although it could be hazy because it is how many years ago is it? 2012. My math is terrible.
Oh,
12 years.
maybe.
So 12 years ago was that, we've tried all sorts of different segments. We've done like favorite things or a recommendation or what's a supplier using or, you know what I mean? Any sort of thing we've tried. So we've tried to kind of like the segment idea and it never really worked for us. We've been very, I don't know, itinerant with the podcast until recently. It's like sometimes it was once a month, then it was once every other week, then it was once a year, then it was I think we've managed to do a podcast in every single year since 2012, but I'm not sure that we quite managed to keep up with the regularity of it. I did find out that you are in the top 1% of podcasters if you make it past 21 episodes.
Oh,
Yeah, which I thought was pretty amazing. So apparently there are like 2 million podcasts or something that people have started. And basically there are 20,000 that have made it past 21 episodes. Because the fact is, like, you're not getting rich. It is a technical barrier. Podcasts, there are certain people I talk to who are like, I don't do podcasts. The same, which is so funny to me because it's the same way that, like, if I said, like, oh, I don't read books. I feel like there'd be a lot of judgment. Like, who just says books are stupid, books are not for me? Like, I don't know. I think that that's a big leap in my opinion. And so the same thing for me is true with podcasts. Like, you may not like podcasts, and I think that's fair to say, but like, I don't do podcasts. I never, that always seems to me like a very, anyway, that's a whole other conversation that we don't need to have because obviously you are listening to a podcast. Why do you need to hear me say this? Okay, so that was kind of like my memory of the origin story. Do you remember anything else?
no, but I remember that when you have guests, it makes the scheduling so difficult.
Mm, right, because we're coordinating 3 people's schedules at that point. We're trying to get the guest and you and me and figure it out. One of the things that we started doing to make the podcast more regular in 2024, which I'm very proud, we've put out a podcast every single week in 2024, and it's this episode will be out in July, is that we've now made a regular date that we schedule it on. And so when
Although, of
we have
course,
had
we're not
guests,
doing it on that regular date
I know,
today.
with some
Because that's the other good thing. When you
flexibility.
only have me as your guest, you can just
Mhm.
shove me around and say, oh, I'm not doing it then. I'm doing it another time. And I just obediently shuffle along to the appointed time and place.
Yes, to be fair though, we generally do it on Wednesdays at 4 these days. And that has been working in terms of keeping it regularly, like that there's an appointment in the calendar, and if we have to move it, we move it. I mean, this is the thing that I say to my art clients too, which is like if you're doing a 100-day project or a daily project or Carve December or anything that involves like having to show up every day, you can't make whatever the task is so draconian that it's hard to keep up with. You have to make it flexible and easy and understand that, like, it could be as simple as I resolve that I will do something art related for 10 minutes every day. And then even if you're in, I don't know, Timbuktu, or stuck in a submarine, like you can find a way to do something for 10 minutes, that's art related. That's a lot easier than saying, I will do a finished painting every day for this. I will finish a collage. I will, whatever it is. Like I think when you put the emphasis on the outcome as opposed to the emphasis on showing up, it's really hard. So technically, we've never said we're going to put out a podcast every week. We have said we're going to show up every Wednesday at 4 and record a podcast. And the rest of it has kind of followed. I think this is the whole thing that people say, like, I mean, this is again theory because I don't do this, but like if you want to go to the gym, put your shoes by the door, make it easy for yourself, have a second set of clothes, have everything ready to go so that there's no barrier to doing it. Anyway, okay, so behind the scenes, the making of the podcast. Dun 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 dun. So, Mom, would you like to explain the making of the podcast from your perspective?
Oh, you send me once a week sort of memo of what the podcast is going to be, except not this week. And
Surprise!
but there's a whole ethical thing about why you want to trick your podcast, partner. Uh, I would say it's usually not self-explanatory. So I sort of look at it and then I wait to find out what you're going to do on the actual podcast, which is what adds the incredible freshness to this recording. And then we sit down. There's usually one of us has a computer problem,
Mm.
right? Because we
Yeah.
do this on our computers.
Tradition.
And so there's always a kind of a mess there. And then we do it. And then afterward, we kind of chat, since I'm starved for attention from you.
Oh, this is a good segue into talking about you. But anyway, what I was going to say is, so from my perspective, I keep a Trello board with all of the podcast topics that I've thought of or that like somebody has suggested to me or guests I want to invite, et cetera, et cetera. And then if you don't know, a Trello board is based on the Kanban system, which is a way of like organizing your thoughts so that they sort of go through different steps. So like it starts off in an idea, then it's like the short list, meaning I've drafted that memo that I'm going to send to Mom and that's ready to go. Or it's been recorded but it needs editing, or it's been edited but it needs promotion, et cetera, et cetera. So it's sort of just like that's where that all sort of goes through. And then like I said, so I need to obviously edit, and we've been doing this thing where we're doing both video and an audio podcast, and that's been interesting to have to edit both of those.
Well, it's also added a burden because I used to be able to do this, come in my pajamas or whatever, haven't brushed my hair. And then now I have to like think about it, which is just one more layer of pressure.
To be fair, I still come in my pajamas and don't brush my hair, but that's just the
But no one can tell on you.
I'm willing to present to the world.
The older you get, the more being pulled together is important to not appear too slovenly.
Well, so I'm just slovenly and middle-aged. I've accepted it. And someday I'll be old and slovenly and I'll still accept it. Okay. So,
we call you eccentric.
there you go. I'm entering my Grey Gardens phase. So, and then it goes up on YouTube. It goes up on the channels, and something I need to get better at, a personal goal for me, slipping ahead to the goals section for the podcast, is I'm really terrible about marketing the podcast. I know there are lots of different ways to do it, and I just don't. So that's something I need to work on.
Yeah, but will you?
Yeah, I
Because
will.
you haven't done it for like 100 and
12
something
years. I
podcasts.
know. I know. I will. It's on my to-do list. There's a lot of stuff on my Trello board to-do list. And what I would say is some of the things that I think have happened as we have sort of like worked on the podcast is figured out on our feet what it's about. A lot of times I find that what other people respond to and what we enjoy doing is just sort of chit chatting. But I have tried more and more to make the podcast have not just an entertainment value, but useful content that people can, write down, think about, listen to the podcast again kind of stuff. So,
I wonder if it would be, I would like to encourage people to write to you
mhm.
if they think of something that would be useful content for them, so that we can have some topics that weren't thought of just by your devious brain.
Yes. Although I have asked your devious brain to come up with some topics too.
You can
Uh,
ask.
and actually, last our podcast that we did 159 maybe on focus was based on a comment and stuff like that. It's one of the reasons I like the listener mail podcast too, because I feel like then it's a conversation. Because at the end of the day, we're not getting famous off this podcast, and we're definitely not making any money off of it. In
What?
fact, it
What?
loses. I know, right? It loses money because paying for podcast hosting, paying for, website fees, paying for all the equipment and blah, blah, blah. Like we're definitely losing money on it. And I think that at the end of the day, then what's the point in doing it? And I think it really is about community, because I find that the people who do listen to the podcast are like the nicest, kindest, most loyal, intelligent, interesting people. And I just, that's the part for me that really drives wanting to do it.
Way to stroke the audience. I will just say, in fairness, you
There
could
you go.
monetize it by selling advertising.
So we could
I'm glad
not
you.
monetize it by selling advertising because we are not big enough for
Yeah,
anybody to
well,
want
so
to
I'm saying I'm glad
advertise.
we don't, because we don't have the pressure of anybody else's issues.
Yes. Yes. Okay, so that's sort of all that. So now we get to the mom questions. This is like when you put the pill
Why?
inside some peanut butter.
Why won't there be Julie
They're
questions?
gonna be Julie questions, but I think like one of the things that is very true is that I'm Miss Piggy in our relationship, and so I have definitely made this all about moi. And you hate the spotlight, and so now it is going to be about you. So, Mom, would you like me to jump off into telling people some places I think we should start, or would you like to begin by just saying a little something about,
I would like you to be in charge, to drive this bus.
Okay, okay, okay. So my mother grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and your father, my grandfather, was a professor of anthropology, and your mom was a stay-at-home mom.
Is this interesting to anyone yet?
It's
Because
very
it's not
interesting
interesting
to
to me.
lots of people. Wait a second. And I'm interested to know, because anthropology and art are not totally unrelated. Did you talk about art, in your household with your parents? Was that a thing?
When I think about it, I'm going to give a lot of credit to my father, who's the one who took me to museums,
Mhm.
took me to cultural events, took me to theater, and who basically I took my little vegetable brain and fed it a lot of stuff that made me realize that the world was much bigger
Mhm.
than just my house. I think one of the things that you have to not underestimate is, even if you take your children to things and they don't become artists, dancers, musicians, still then they become aware, appreciative,
Mhm.
consumers of all the above. So I can still remember every time my father would do something, like he would say, "Oh, we're going to see the Moissy of dancers," and I would say, "What? The Moissy of dancers?" And this was a time when there were not a lot of cultural exchanges between Russia and the United States, and this Russian dance troupe that had never come before. That's how old I am. And it was eye-opening to me. It just, I think, so similarly, I once took your brother and his friend when they were, I think, in middle school to the opera or the ballet or something.
Mhm.
And they drove me crazy, but I always feel that it was good that I did that, you know? At
Yeah.
least they know it's out there.
Yeah. I think exposure is such an important thing. And even though like it drives me crazy to take my 4-year-old to the museum, like I can't enjoy the museum. I have to be on him, have to really watch him. I can't, you know what I mean? He's complaining the whole time. I still feel like it's important that he's there and, learns all these things. Okay. So now I know that you traveled as a child. In fact, you lived abroad in India. And this is a time that's somewhat pre as much airplane travel as we used to do. So you took a boat.
Yes, but also I think my parents liked boats.
Mm.
But that was in the days when airplane travel was not so common.
Hmm.
Um, and the dinosaur wasn't running at that time, so we
The
took
dinosaur
both.
would have had to swim very, very far to get from Chicago all the way to India.
Yes, but so I've lived in India, I've lived in Japan, I've lived in England,
Hmm.
uh, which is I think is a really good thing for a child to learn that there's more than one way to do things, more than one way to
Hmm.
have school, more than one kind of food, to eat, more than one way to speak to people.
Hmm.
And I think you had the benefit of a lot of travel when you were little, and it opens you up in a different way to notice things,
Hmm.
right? And
Well, and to
you could
understand
probably talk
different.
about what travel did for you.
Well, I was gonna say you and Dad toted us around to back in the days, 100 years ago, when airline travel, pardon me, wasn't as draconian as it is now. Um, Whenever my father would go on a business trip, he would cash in his business class ticket that had been paid for 4 coach tickets, and we would all go wherever he was going. And oftentimes it was very interesting places. And so, I think we managed to hit every continent except for Australia and Antarctica as a family, although I did make it to Australia on my own. But yeah, we went to Africa, we went to South America, we went all over, Central America, we went to Europe. And I remember tromping through lots of things that I hated, that I thought were boring, that I want to kick the little snot nosed 8-year-old who was, bored in Italy, because wouldn't I love to take that trip right now? But I mean, I think that that's the thing, which is like I was aware at a very young age how lucky I was, because I saw real poverty that scared the bejesus out of me, on lots of our trips when we went, and you would see what a real slum is like, and what, people are living like, and understand that it was different. I think that, to know that cultures are different wherever you go. Like I remember when we went to Thailand, you guys were very clear with us, like, don't touch other children's heads, don't do this, don't do that, so that we would know sort of what the cultural norms are. And I think that that's something that helps you uncenter yourself, to remember that you are not the center of the universe, and what you think is normal is just your normal. It's not the normal. As they say, and I think it's true, like people who don't travel, the world is a book, and people who don't travel read only one page.
Well,
Because
doesn't it also open you up to things, to noticing things like architecture, for example?
Mhm.
I remember you went through a phase where which you still may be in, where you used to photograph doorways.
Well, I still do. I
If
love doorways. Paris is my favorite doorway city, but yes, doors, doors, doors.
I mean, I just think it's like when you move something in your house and suddenly that room in your house looks different. When you go to a different setting, visual setting,
Yeah.
you know, you start to cue in on some of those things in your own life.
Hmm. I think it's true. And, I often talk about how I, as a biracial person, am dealing with like different cultures and a lot of perception versus reality. But you grew up in a very bicultural household. Your parents sort of accidentally immigrated from China because they didn't intend to, but then they kind of got stuck here. And you, but they were really like interested in being American in a lot of ways. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I don't think that's right. I think what it was my father
Mhm.
had gone to graduate school in England, and my mother always said that he was not really Chinese. He was a marginal man, meaning he didn't have sort of the a lot of the characteristics that you think of as typically that culture. I think, and he already had a lot of facility, obviously, in English and a lot of other languages. My mother came to America and she didn't speak anything but Chinese, so she had a hard. I think she had a very hard time, and I have the greatest respect for her because she, as you said, didn't intend to stay. They came. My father was invited to teach at Columbia, so they came for that, and then he taught at Cornell, and then at Northwestern, and then we were literally on a boat, sort of on our way to Hawaii because they were bringing us all back to China. I was like 4 years old, or even 3, so I was kind of oblivious to what was happening. And then the Chinese Revolution happened, and my father wrote to his brother and said, "What do you think? Should I still keep coming?" And the brother wrote back and said, "Why don't you wait and see what happens?" So we ended up not going, quote unquote, back to China. So I think my mother adjusted incredibly well to the point where, after all that time here, she she could read English, she could speak English, she could enjoy a movie in English, she could, do math in English. But I think that was not her intention. As far as my father goes, he was very adaptable. So that was not a problem for him. I think he actually would have been happier here than if he had made it back to China.
And tell me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is that there weren't a ton of Chinese women in America.
Right. That was a time when it was very hard to emigrate if you were in certain categories, Chinese being one of them, and they were not encouraging people to bring their families because they basically wanted them to go back, come work and then go back. So I know now when you go to any college or you go to any urbans, that you see lots of Asians of all kinds. But when I was growing up, no.
Hmm. Must have been even harder, I've been thinking, for grandma when there aren't a lot of other Chinese women around at all. So then you're really feeling at sea.
Right,
So let's talk a little bit about you have studied art history, like actually taken art history classes. Was that
right.
part of the required curriculum for you? Like
Yeah,
just part of the regular
yeah.
education or
It was
something you
just
wanted
well,
to do?
it was an interest in
Mm-hmm.
college,
Mm-hmm.
and my boyfriend at the time was an art history major. You know,
Mm-hmm.
all
So
sorts of things, and then also I had uh, intellectually, I find it very interesting art history
mhm,
because there's a lot of there's cultural stuff to learn, there's psychological stuff to figure out, as well as the visual stuff, and the the comparison between cultures can easily be done studying the different art styles, art history, the subjects, what they think is important in one culture may not be important in another, the materials. It's anything to do with people, I find interesting, I
mhm,
find compelling.
mhm.
So art history, yes, it fits.
Is there a particular period of art that you're like, this is it? This is my art period. Like for me, I could look at the abstract expressionists all day long and never get bored by it.
I don't think so. I think in that in that sense, I have very Catholic tastes, meaning I have
Mhm.
very broad tastes.
So let's talk a little bit about, well, I was going to say, let's talk a little bit about how there was sort of a cultural shift while you were in school that I remember you've talked about, which is when you went into college, it was very, women required to wear skirts at dinner, and you had to, like, it was very what I think of as like, how can this be the world we live in? The sort of expectation that most of the women, even in college, would go on to be homemakers and all this kind of stuff. And then by the time you left college, something had shifted enormously and a lot of the rules had changed.
I was in college in the late 60s. And so a lot of social movements were going on. There was a lot of rethinking about what was what was the norm changed. So what I think is there are times when social change is more quick. There are times when it's slower or it's regrouping or retrenching. But one of the secrets, I think, of having a happy life, which is probably everybody should be everybody's goal, is that you don't keep looking over your shoulder and saying it was better then, because it isn't then and it's never going to be then again. You figure out what's going to work for you in the new life. Doesn't
Mhm.
mean you have to adopt every new social thing that comes along, cultural thing, but you have to figure out what's going to work for you now, and then look ahead to the future and say, oh, maybe I better learn to use a computer, because when I went to college, nobody had a computer. I took one course that was a very specialized course where we had the punch cards. Remember the punch cards? You don't.
Mm-mm, not old enough.
Yeah, and I remember learning that the basic punch cards had just these slots, and it was either a plus or a minus.
Mhm.
And I remember learning that those were originally a result of centuries before figuring out how to weave textiles. And it was the textile designs that they did with punch cards. Um,
That makes sense. Interesting.
so,
So it's all related to art. That's what I heard
or
you just
sort of
say.
like a player piano, it's either a little prong or it's not a prong. So I feel like for a long time, I could say, "Oh, I don't want to learn how to do this computer thing. It's
Mhm.
too difficult, and I'll need somebody else to do it for me." Or you just go ahead and say, "Well, this is going to be important in my daily life. I have to figure it out." And it's the same thing with a lot of other things, and same thing with art. I could sit around and say all day, "Oh, I don't like this modern music." I went to several John Cage uh, concerts. Um,
For people
often
who don't know John Cage, by the way, just to be clear, like a John Cage concert could involve like all the instruments being played at once, no instruments being played, one note being held for 20 minutes. Like it could be a lot of stuff.
I went to perhaps one of the. I went to one where it was Merce Cunningham was a choreographer, and he was choreographing these dancers, and the music was someone was going around the building of the theater um, with broadcasting equipment, and he would be like in the basement banging on the pipes, uh, just taking noises from the building, and then the dancers would be dancing. So that was that was one of those situations where it was either you can open your mind to it and try to figure out if any part of it works for you, or you can just say, oh, that's not for me,
Hmm.
that's dumb,
Hmm.
and then move on. And I think that a lot of times I try to think, well, what is my resistance? What
Hmm.
is the basis of my resistance to this new art form? And then I try to figure out, is there anything here that appeals to me? Because just rejecting things is not the way that I like to live.
Yeah, and that's something you've definitely given to me. I mean, you've taken me to a lot of eye rollers. You've taken me to a lot of things.
Do you recite
Uh,
any events?
but I mean, but
Any
it's true. But it's
incidents?
everything from simple things like jazz concerts where I was like, what is happening as the music fell apart around me and I don't understand anything that's happening, to, modern dance where again, I'm deeply confused, to contemporary arts, just a lot of things. And you've always been a person who pushes me to look harder, look further, think about it, like, and to understand context as well. Like, what is John Cage doing that as a reaction to? And if you can understand the intellectual underpinnings of what he's trying to get to, can you then at the very least appreciate, the thought that's out there, even if you're not like moving your body to the pipes or whatever else may be happening. And so I think that's very much a way that I try to approach my own making, and try to have conversations with people about their art, my art, and try to also embrace in the teaching is like, it's that old thing a little bit about walking a mile in somebody else's shoes in some way, because it's the idea that you need to not just like have a wall of judgment that snaps up automatically, but you need to take a moment with all sorts of things and say like, okay, let's try to drill down here. And it's even in this little stuff, like somebody gives you attitude, gives you the finger on the road, like as a total jerk, like can you take a moment and breathe and say, maybe they're having a terrible day, you know? And this is
And if
not
they're
about,
not, I hope they will.
yeah, and if they're not, they are going to be now. Anyway, yeah. So there's a lot of stuff about that. Okay, so now you have been an art collector as long as I have known you. Um, is that something that you like started early on? Is this something that you came to later in life? Like, did you always like to buy art?
Well, I'll tell you where I think, uh, you know, when you're a teenager, you decorate your room. So you have posters and you have stuff like that. And then I went to college, and the college I went to actually had a program, still has it, where you can borrow art from the museum that's connected. You
I did
know,
not know that. That's really
you
cool.
can borrow art for your dorm room for the year.
Wow.
So I started doing that.
Mhm.
And as a result,
Awesome home with you.
I enjoyed it. And so I also am kind of a pack rat, and I like to have something from where I went on a trip, or, I might save something from a restaurant that had a particularly
Mhm.
important moment for me there or something. So I I like having those things. And so the combination just sort of was good for me. And then I like going to craft fairs, artisan fairs, you know what I mean? Art fairs. And when you see something that you like, maybe you want to take it home, and maybe it's in your price range. So you do take it home.
Mhm.
But I will also cut things out and put them up, you know, just
Mhm.
because I like to be reminded of that. So I'll cut something out of a program or something.
Yes, and you always have arty calendars. It's become quite a tradition
Oh,
that you
yeah.
give all of us art calendars each year too.
Yes. Currently, the grandchildren are in the dinosaur Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle calendars, which are less interesting to me, but I try to get something that's interesting to them. And then every month it's like a changing little art show in their rooms.
Mhm. Well, so I have the best art calendar. I mean, I do have a Kandinsky monthly calendar that's stuck on March. But I also have this art a day calendar from the Met, that this is the second year in a row that you've got me this calendar. It is my absolute favorite calendar, and I two thumbs up recommend it to anybody. It's a daily calendar. It's a desk calendar, and it has a work of art from the Met's collection with a picture and then a little bit about the art written on it. Weekends, very disappointingly, Saturday and Sunday are lumped together, so it's not every
That
day.
seems wrong, doesn't it?
Advertising says it's every day of the week. But yeah, so it's great. I love it. I discover all sorts of interesting things. I thought in a interesting coincidence yesterday, there was a statue by Harriet Hosmer, who actually is who many
From
things in this town that we live in Watertown, were named after Harriet Hosmer. So I was like, oh my gosh. And I don't think I'd ever really seen a picture of, it's a picture of her with one of her enormous sculptures. And I don't think I had ever seen that picture. So that was kind of an exciting, I felt like a real hometowner when I was like, oh my God. And I had a moment where I was like, I know her. And I was like, you don't know her. She's dead. What are you talking about? But anyway, it felt very personal, more than like when you see a famous painter. But there have been a couple of contemporary painters in the calendar who I've been like, oh, I didn't know this person, and now I do. And that's exciting. And I go look them up, somebody new to think about. Okay. That's neither here nor there. I was going to say, now the question I have is, has the podcast in any way changed your thinking about art or clarified it in some way?
I don't think it's changed the way I think about art, because we're often talking about artists and the work of being an artist and the life of being an artist. And I think it gives me insight into some of the issues that you have in your work. And since I'm interested in you, at least for now, it's interesting to me.
Is it a surprise to you that I became an artist?
Well, yes, because first you decided you were going to be a political scientist for I have no idea why. And then you became
law school.
a theatrical director. And then you were busy working as a theatrical director in New York. And then you had this little scrapbook hobby. And then the next thing I know, you decide you're going to do that and actually manage to make money at that. And then the next thing I know, now you're doing this. I think it's logical. The progression is logical. But the thing is that both you and your brother have ended up doing artsy careers, which is not surprising to me at all, because I think
shame for you as an Asian parent. Deep shame for you. Have you no Asian tiger mom in you at all? Where's your doctor?
You should be answering that. You're the one who should be answering that.
I have no shame. I'm out. I've been shamed too much. I've got one parent who's Jewish, one parent who's Chinese. There's so much shame in between. It has negated itself, and I've become a positive. Now I am shameless. And I married a Catholic man. So I'm just saying, guilt, 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 guilt. Okay, so I would say, how do you think then, if the podcast hasn't sort of changed or shaped you, how do you think you have changed or shaped the podcast? The podcast is different because you are a part of it.
I think because I am so much older, I view things in a more, a mile high viewpoint as opposed to on the ground. And I think it's a good balance. Because often I
just think because you're older, though. I think like that has you. I mean, like, yes, you've always been older than me. It is the nature of being a mother and a daughter. But like, you have always been something, and I think like on all the committees you work on and all the things you've done, people have always said like you're the person who always takes the longer, bigger picture view, who wants to talk about the consequences past a single action, who sees the big picture and insists upon shoving the ugly big picture in your face when you just want to focus on some other things. Like that's always been who you are. And it's not unrelated to the idea of like being open, right, to things that are happening and not like slamming up a wall. I mean, it's a very similar way of thinking in my mind. Do you agree?
My God. Yes.
Like I know you.
I'm going to be mulling this over tonight.
Mm.
and insight.
Yes, yeah, this therapy will be $475.
Well,
So
my
yeah,
bill for appearing on this podcast will be $500.
why am I always losing money on this podcast? Uh, yeah, I mean, I think that I know that you have always been sort of the voice of reason, the person who I I can be hot-headed, shall we say.
Really?
Yeah, just a little, just a
Maybe an
little.
insight for you then.
Yeah, it's a big insight. Uh, and have a little bit of a spark. And so it's very interesting because I think both you and Steve, my husband, often are the ones who are like, whoa, 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 breath, calm down. Let's think about this for a moment. Um, and like that's an important dynamic.
Well, if there's one thing I do often say, I think, when something comes up that's upsetting, I say, time is a player.
Mm,
So
it's true.
many things which feel urgent. I'm not saying everything, but many things which feel urgent, time will help figuring it out.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't have to necessarily be resolved this second. You may change, circumstances may change, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a way of thinking about life where it means that you're not moving from crisis to crisis all the time. Now, of course, there are some things that are
Right.
urgent, but I'm saying not everything that is upsetting has to be resolved this minute.
At a level 10. Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I agree. Well, how do you think that the podcast has changed over the last 12 years?
Well, for one thing, as you said, we used to have a guest every time,
Mm-hmm.
and now we have a guest sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually enabled your voice in particular to be heard more, which is, I think, the basis of why people are attracted to this podcast.
Well, that
Because,
it's something you used to tell me all the time, which is you would say, you need to talk more. You need to say
right, well, you were like the moderator slash hostess, and
mm-hmm.
you wanted to have the guest shine. But I feel like a lot of times people were tuning in not just for the guest, but
Mm-hmm.
for you, your thoughts, your reactions, your experiences. And so this has been, I think, a good trend for the podcast.
Mm-hmm. I will say that I think that the reason when I think about the podcast that I like, it's almost always that there's something about the host's personality or something that I'm attracted to. Usually, if I get annoyed by the host, even when the content is really good, and like for instance, there are a couple marketing podcasts that I had to stop listening to because I was so annoyed by the hosts that I just couldn't do it. And there are other podcasts where like I'm not even really interested in the topic, but I like the host so much or I enjoy it or I find it funny. So I keep listening because I think podcasts are intimate. Like it's for the most part, it's somebody in your house, you're doing something, they're with you, they're in your car, they're sitting in their car with you. I mean, when I paint a painting and listen to a podcast, like there's one where I was on a streak with this podcast Morbid, which is all like it's a murder podcast basically, a serial killer podcast also. And I swear to you, I just, every time I look at that painting, I just think she was murdered. She was found crammed under the bed, naked. And I'm like, oh gosh, that's in the painting now because it's in my head. So I should really listen to more positive things when I'm working, I feel like. Okay, so I would say thinking about where the podcast might be going.
Yeah, where would you like it to go?
Where would I like it to go? Well, I mean, I'd like it if it magically made money or something. That would be great. But at the end of the day, like, where would I like it to go? What would I like it to do? I would love it if the workflow of it could become a little bit easier for me. Like, I love coming up with the topics and I love drafting the thoughts. I love the recording of it. I hate editing it. I hate all the technical back end stuff that has to get done to like generate a transcript and get the metadata in it and blah, 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 like the really boring technical part of it. I hate all that part. So maybe
Although
in the
some of it is
future,
your fault because a lot of podcasts don't have any of that, and yet you decided to put that in.
Well, I mean, some of it
So
you need to do.
you are the master of your own fate there
Some of it you need to do. If the podcast ever made money, I feel like I would pay somebody to do
to
that.
do it.
That's the main thing, right?
Sure.
But I think like in terms of where it's going, I think for me, in some ways, the podcast is a reflection always of where I am in my thought process. And I love that about it. Like I realize
Again, it's all about you.
it is. I'm the Miss Piggy in the situation. I've said that before. She's a heart of gold, but she's got a short fuse, and it's all about moi. So I think like the thing is, it's I like sort of that idea that it reflects where I am, because when I look back at episodes from a year ago, 2 years ago, I can see that I was thinking about the whole idea, for instance, of an art practice and my art practice and all that kind of stuff, but I hadn't actually formalized it even to myself, but all the seeds were there. And it's like now I have this record of it that's fascinating to me, that it's there, that it exists, that it was what I was interested in. And the same thing with, the very first podcast we ever did was with Rhonda Polazari, and it was on the topic of failure. And I think that has been something that is still something that I think is important, that I want to scream from the rooftops to people, that failure is not to be feared, and failure is a step in the process. And we just did our growth mindset podcast, which is all about how you have to view failure differently. And so I see certain strands that keep coming through time and time again, and it's just like it's a reminder to me that I'm still the same person, that I'm still developing and growing. And actually Sonia, my friend Sonia, texted me today, Sonia, and she said, this is a friend of, so this is someone who I've been friends with since first grade. And she lives in another state, and she texted me to say that she had been listening to the podcast, and I had mentioned her on the podcast and some advice she had given, and she said she felt very good about it. She listens every week, and she's a doctor.
I
And she
didn't know that she listens. That's
I didn't
interesting.
either. I didn't either, but it was nice to hear, and it was just a reminder to me that, again, there's something so nice about that feeling of connecting with others. So I guess if anything, like I'm hoping the podcast continues to create connections. That's really my goal. I don't have any sexy, like, our new segment will be 5 paint colors that you should try this week, and then we'll have, an interview with famous artist, so and so. Like, it's just that's this podcast is like it's a scrappy, happy little side project that I enjoy doing, and that I hope other people enjoy too. Right? Would you have hopes for the future of this podcast, the fame and fortune?
No, I'm expecting neither fame nor fortune. But it's, you know what it is? It gives us a little tiny portion of time to just sit and chat, which between everybody's busy life and kids and, health and all these things,
Yeah.
is rare to just allow ourselves to just sit and chat.
Yeah. I agree. I agree.
So that's
Okay.
neat.
So I'm glad people got to know a little bit about you. This was the most non-threatening way I could think of interviewing you, although I know you still found it threatening, but you did a good job. Let's just close
Not
out.
condescending much.
Only a little. Only when I have to be. But what I was going to say is, why don't we close out with what are a couple podcasts that you would recommend to other people to listen to? They do not have to be art related, but what are some ones that you listen to and you enjoy?
One of them is it called How I Made This?
How I Built This with Guy
How I
Raz.
Built,
Yeah.
where it started on NPR, but I don't know if it's still on NPR, but I know the podcast is still going, and it's people talking about how they built their businesses and the surprising turns that things took. And one of the things that always comes across in every successful entrepreneur's life is this thing about failure, that they come up against various roadblocks and they pivoted their business. And actually, it might have become a whole new business, because you can't succeed with this mindset that you're going to make it this one thing no matter what. And I find that reassuring, to think about whenever I'm trying to do something. okay, if I come up against something that's making it that impossible, can I turn this into something good? That works for me.
Almost every single founder who's on that podcast always talks about the millions of ways they failed and the millions of people who told them they were crazy.
Right.
It's good to know, right? Any other recommendations?
Uh, I do. I listen to a lot of sports podcasts, which
There may be other sports people out there. What do you like?
they'll have to find their own. Uh, and I also listen to. You turned me on to. Is it Smartless?
Oh yeah, I love Smartless.
Which is three actors
Mhm.
basically interviewing the people, but they're very. It's an interesting thing because on the one hand, they're very knowledgeable in some areas, but they also interview people who are in areas that they don't really have knowledge, and they're as much in awe of these celebrities as we are.
Mhm.
And there's also a good kind of charming, a
Friendship.
charming charisma between the three hosts, which is again back to the thing about you being the host and people tuning in no matter what the topic. You know,
Mhm.
this week we're talking about mud, and I think people would still listen. And so we're going to do it next week just to test it out. Uh, I just think the host is the whole ball of wax.
Mhm.
You know, it's just like I listen to audiobooks,
Yeah.
and if I don't like the reader, I
Mhm.
can't enjoy it no matter how good the book is,
Yeah.
because the relationship between me, the listener, and the reader has to work for me.
Agreed. Agreed. I would say I probably listen to like 10 or 12 podcasts fairly regularly. The ones that like I'm would that I think might be useful, let's say in the art category, I would say I really like The Week in Art, which is a podcast out of the UK. And so it does focus more on the UK art scene, but it is very global. It's an art advisory in the UK who hosts it, and they give you all the information about important exhibits, acquisitions, things that have happened. They do interviews. It's like a couple segments in a show. Very, very interesting and thoughtful. So I like that, and a little bit of contemporary art knowledge. Global contemporary art knowledge never hurt anybody. And then I have been listening to a lot of Morbid, which again is, if you like true crime mystery, then Morbid is good for you. I also really enjoy Marketplace, which is a financial podcast from
I
NPR.
listen
I
to that
feel
too.
like, yeah, they neither dumb it down nor do shop talk too much. So I feel like I am being spoken to in plain language. I understand the economics that they're talking about. I get some human interest stories along with it. Um, I feel like it's gives me a basic handle on like what the Fed is doing right now, which is not a sentence I thought I would ever say, but I'm in my 40s and I feel like that's a good sentence to be able to say. Um, let's see what else. One other podcast do I really like right now that I'm super listening to? Oh, you know what? I've been binging a lot of Pop Culture Happy Hour, which is a
Yeah.
daily podcast. And what I like about it is I don't have to watch anything, but I know everything about what is happening. So they do, because it's pop culture, not just movies and they do movies, TV, music, books. Like if people are talking about it, if it's in the cultural zeitgeist, they are talking about it. And so I feel like this obscure series on Netflix or the really popular Star Wars, series or whatever it is, like I don't have to watch it. I listen to it. I can have a conversation with somebody about it later and like I'm good. So
What's
that's
the name of it again? Pop culture.
Pop Culture Happy Hour. And
Yeah.
they have an ever rotating panel of people. So there are like four main hosts, but they're rarely the four of them together. It's
Okay.
almost always like one or two of the hosts with other people, and like they make an effort to bring in sort of demographically appropriate people. So like I listened to one today that was about the new the new Native movie that Lily Gladstone's in, and so they had a panel that was mostly Native people. You know, there, if it's a Latinx situation, if it's a, you know what, like they try, I think, to generally have people who can speak to whatever the cultural experience might be that's going on with it, which is also interesting because it'll be, you know, there'll be somebody on the panel who speaks Korean who says like, oh, the Korean in this was like really weird and not the kind, you know what I mean? And somebody else who doesn't, and they can have a conversation about that then, you know? So I enjoy it. Anyway, so let us know what podcast you're listening to. I always find that interesting. I'd love to add more to my rotation, have a few, have fewer murder podcasts in my mind and some more happy stuff. In the meantime, if you want to connect, you can find me at juliebalzer.com or all over social media as at Balzer Designs. Mom keeps it down, locked down and private, so you can't find her. Um, I really hope that you'll sign up for the free weekly newsletter. That's the best way to make sure you keep up on the latest news. And you can, there's a big button on the homepage of juliebalzer.com where you can do that, or you can go to the show page for this podcast to find the link. If you'd like to help the show, you can leave a review. I saw today that there are like 97 reviews or something on Apple Podcasts, which I appreciate so much. It really helps other people find the show. Like that's the thing that when I was saying that I need to work on marketing for the podcast, one of the more than any marketing I can do, you writing a review like times 10 what I could do. So that would be awesome if you'd be willing to do that. Mentioning us on social media, telling a friend, putting you know, giving a letter to a snail to carry somewhere, all of those things help other people find the show. So thank you so much for listening and subscribing. We'll see you the next time on the Adventures in Arting podcast.